But if you don't listen, you might miss the gold. You might miss the opportunity to ask the follow-up question, which unlocks everything that you really need to hear, whether that's in a podcast or whether that's from a potential customer that's going to tell you exactly how to really win their business that they wouldn't tell you if you don't ask that question. You and I both know that facts tell, stories sell, and people really buy into these guys because of the journeys they've been on. This podcasting thing is a lot more my bag. I think I can contribute in this space. And don't just do it for, I think I'm going to grow this massive podcast and be the next Chris Williamson or Joe Rogan or whoever. That's a great question, and it is a real risk.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sales Cadence Podcast. My name's Matt Sykes, I'm your host, and joining me on the episode today is someone I first met back in August 2020 when he interviewed me on his podcast, CamBro Conversations. His name is Colin Campbell, and back then I was episode number 30. 3.5 years later on, and Colin has gone on to record over 240 episodes and has elevated his podcast to a rising star in the what he refers to as the brain, body and business category. Colin has gone on to interview standout guests such as Chris Williamson of Modern Wisdom, Daniel Priestly, a name you'll be familiar with, and Rory Sutherland. It truly is a blueprint for how to build and grow a podcast, and this is what we talk about on today's episode. Colin's a sales director by day, and if that wasn't enough, he still has capacity within his working week to have a very disciplined health and fitness lifestyle too. And if you follow Colin on any of the socials, you'll see he puts in the hours. If you're interested to find out how to reach the top 1% of podcasts, be able to attract the elite from the business world as a guest to join you on your show, then Colin is the guy with all the answers. And this episode is definitely for you. We could have spoken for hours, Colin and myself, and simply because I respect yours, Colin's, and my time, it's limited to just 60 minutes. I really hope you enjoy it. Colin Campbell, welcome to the Sales Cadence Podcast.
Matt, thank you for having me. It's a full circle moment from me interviewing you almost 3 years ago now, and we're back together and we're having a chat.
This is bonkers, mate. But I've so wanted to get you onto the podcast for that reason, because it was, 3.5 years ago, something like that. You very kindly invited me onto your show. Your show has gone stratospheric, my friend, since we were last on a podcast together. So I'm so excited and so intrigued to be able to unpack that story. So I'm just really chuffed that you're on the podcast. Really looking forward to the next, I guess it'll be about an hour's worth of chat. We could talk forever. But listen, before we start, obviously the listeners, certainly the core listeners, will know all about your podcast. We'll get to that in a second. Before we do that, just give the listeners 60 seconds background.
Of course, Matt. And it's funny, I definitely wear two hats. So it's always interesting depending what kind of podcast I go on or what audience that I'm speaking to in terms of how I introduce myself. But I quite often talk about myself as an office athlete, and that's somebody that looks to pursue peak performance across the different areas of his life that he turns his hand to. And at this moment in time, that continues to be as a sales director in the design-led furniture space, as a podcaster and a content creator, and as somebody that looks after his mind and his body with his training, his nutrition, and of course his social and his family life as well. So that's typically how I introduce myself. And I said I wear two hats. I probably try and be quote unquote professional in two arenas, and that's the sales arena, which I'm sure we'll go deep on today, and that's the content creation and the podcasting side of things, which again is another topic that we can go at length on.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm like a kid in a sweet shop, if I'm honest with you. The two worlds I enjoy the most, obviously sales, as you've alluded to in your kind of corporate role, and then of course the podcasting thing. And really what my selfish intentions today as we're talking is, can I get some advice from you around the podcast world? But let's go to the sales world first. Colin, what were you doing when you made your very first sale?
I think my first official sale, I was in between my first year and my second year at university. And my first summer job that I'd had in between the semesters was as a sports coach. And that was all very natural to me. I'd coached rugby lots of times growing up. But I had about 4 or 5 weeks before the semester started, and I wanted to keep earning some cash. And I applied for this job with a business called Ensley Insurance, and they are a student insurance company. And initially, the advert was very much about promoting and marketing at freshers' fairs and student move-in days. And there wasn't an awful lot about the fact that it was a sales role. So I applied for it, and it turned out that what we were doing we were selling student gadget and content insurance to students who were living away from home for the first time.
Okay.
And I didn't ever picture myself as a salesperson, but I honestly loved it from the start. I got such a buzz from speaking to people, particularly people that were excited about the journey they were about to go on, but maybe hadn't thought about some of the different risks or some of the different challenges they might experience when they go and live in student accommodation for the first time. They're away from mum and dad, they're away from school or whatever else they've been involved in. And they're bringing with them some pretty valuable, important items. So that was the first sales role that I ever did. And my first sale, I can't remember it exactly, but I did a whole host of different items and gadgets that I insured. I think one of the first kind of big premiums that I got was we insured like a sewing machine for a student that was moving to Glasgow School of Art. And I think his premium was something like £212 or something like that for the sewing machine itself, because it was worth something like, I don't know, £4,500. And then he had a £500 Acer laptop they insured for like 25 quid. So it was a really funny situation where many students were so passionate about their phone and their mobile and their laptop or their tablet. But this guy in particular was more concerned about his sewing machine, because that meant a lot for his course, and it was one of his most valuable possessions. So that was one of my first sales. And it was an interesting one, Matt, because I was speaking to both the student, but typically their parent or their guardian or whoever had come with them to move them into accommodation. So you were playing two roles. You were speaking to the students on their level, and bear in mind, I'm only like, I think I was 18 or 19 at this point, but you're also speaking to mum and dad and the person that maybe holds the financial keys to this sale as well. So it was an amazing experience for me in terms of what I've gone on to do.
So just going back to that, then, did you fall into a sales role, or is it? I mean, you're in a career now, which is essentially you are a sales director. So one would assume that at the moment, at least, your career path is you've decided to make that choice to be, in the sales arena. Did you originally fall into a sales role then, or is it something that you actively looked to head into?
I completely fell into it. My aspirations as a young man were to be a sports journalist, and I went to study politics at the University of Glasgow because when I was 15, 16, I was going around the country writing the match reports for the men's team at my rugby club. And every journalist that I spoke to in the press box when I was there said, don't do a journalism degree because they're producing them 10 a penny and then you'll be pigeonholed. Instead, go and do a degree where you show that you can write well, whether that's in a social science or psychology or philosophy or politics, whatever it was. And then at least you can pivot and do something else. But that degree also qualifies you for almost nothing either. It shows that you're intelligent, can take vast amounts of information, distill it down and pass it on. But it doesn't necessarily, in the same way like a medicine degree or an engineering degree or a law degree or a dentistry degree has an immediate career path. That's not the case in social sciences. So I initially wanted to be a sports journalist, but that changed quite quickly. I think it would have been 3 or 4 months into my time at university in 2010 when the Glasgow Herald, the kind of big Scottish newspaper that did a lot of sports reporting, made something like 80% of its staff redundant and instead relied upon freelancers. And I quite quickly decided that I didn't really fancy working in a sector that was downsizing. And I also knew from my own habits that I didn't really read newspapers. I read all my news, particularly sports news about the football and the rugby, online. And that's just continued down the track. So no, I didn't have a initial quest to be in the sales industry, but I fell into it with that initial summer job. And I honestly can tell you, Matt, I loved it from the start. I really came out of my shell a lot during that time.
Something happens to most people, Colin, certainly ones that I talk to on this podcast. Something happens to them in life where the word or the topic or the subject matter of sales becomes quite important to them for a variety of different reasons. Some people, can be a little bit like that kind of moment that you explained there, where you had this emotional charge of, endorphins because you'd managed to close a deal. Others because perhaps in a slightly different context where they're struggling in a business and at that point sales becomes important to them. Do you happen to remember a time in your life when selling actually became quite an important part of your life?
I think it became important to me because there was an element of mastery that I was gaining, and I could see the progress in it. And I very much benefit from going through skills and activities where I can get a positive feedback loop based on the effort and the focus that I invest into that area, whether that's been in my physical training, whether that's been in my sales career, whether that's been in my pursuit of growing the podcast to where it is, whether that's been in my pursuit of, from a personal development perspective, becoming a better, more actualized man. All these things give me a positive feedback loop based on the effort that you put in. And I think with sales in particular, when you follow a process, when you invest in training, when you improve your mindset, when you improve your communication, these things all lead to like really feeling great. And for me at 18, 19, I didn't love university. I'd actually just stopped playing rugby, which I played at a really high level growing up. And I was looking for something that would demonstrate to me that I was somebody that was doing something of value. And when you become part of an organization and, oh, Colin, you're top of the leaderboard for all the Scottish temporary staff that we brought on, that's amazing. We're going to bring you down to the north of England to sell at the universities there. I was thinking, wow, this feels great, Matt. Like this feels really good. I should double down on this and push forward. And I think that's when it became important, because it was a means of me demonstrating capability. And we all want to feel a purpose. We want to feel part of something. And when you're part of a sales team and you're working towards a target together, you're pulling in the same direction together.
You touched on a couple of things there I want to just explore in a second around personal development. And I mean, you keep yourself in great shape. Ever since I've known you, you've always been, in the gym. You really look after your nutrition. You set yourself regular goals, and by all accounts, visually looking at you, mate, you're achieving them. If we just stay on the sales narrative for one more second, Colin, you've obviously educated yourself. You've been through a fair amount of training. I think you actually train your own team, or you deliver training as well now. So if you were to give some advice to some of the sales guys and girls on here who are perhaps just starting their journey, so maybe they are, in that place where you were a few years back when you first started out, what advice have you learned from some of? I mean, you've spent some time with people like Andy Bounds, and one of the best around. So, is there one or two pieces of advice that you would offer to someone who's just starting out in the sales industry?
Interestingly enough, those early days when I was selling that kind of contents or gadget insurance, it was very confidence led. You needed to portray a level of confidence and expertise and be trusted by the person you were dealing with. And sometimes I disagree with the whole people buy from people piece, because it comes down to more than that. It comes from people buy from people they trust quite a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I learned quite quickly that if I could get the student and the parent that I was dealing with back then to trust me and to see that I knew about the product I was telling them, I knew about the environment they were going into, I knew about the process that should they ever have to use the product, this is how it would go, and this is what it would look like, and this is how you would move forward. It was all about reassurance. And those early days, I really learned that as a skill set. And I still use one of the key words I use all the time when I talk to my customer base now or potential new customers. I'm always talking about to reassure you, this is how it will look. This is what will happen. And that actually links into a lot of what I kind of formally learned through Andy Bounds. His training was instructive at a place that I moved to in 2019.
Right.
I moved into the the more corporate insurance industry, a large insurance broker called Marsh. And all the sales training there was based on Andy's afters concept, which is all about, you're not your product or your service, you're talking about the after effect, or what happens after somebody uses your product or service, because that's what they care about. Rather than caring about your company and your past, they care about their outcomes and their future. And that was so important, and that remains with me to this day. Like, you should see some of my prospecting emails, Matt. They're all about the afters. Like, after you deal with David Phillips, after you deal with me, this is what you can expect. You're bringing that to life for them. And so I think that's something that as salespeople, we always need to be reminded of and dragged back to, because it's very easy to fall into those classic bad habits of me, when really you should be thinking customer and their outcomes at all times. And of course, what role you play on that journey. But you cannot go too heavy on, we were founded in X year and we've got Y number of years of experience and we've got this number of warehouses and this number of unique attributes that we can support with. The customer doesn't really care until you get into the nitty gritty. It's far more important that you're telling them or understanding from them what they care about and how you can help them get to that point in time or whatever situation they're aiming for.
Amen to that. And still staggers me, Colin, that there are so many organisations out there that yet haven't quite grasped that kind of sales 101 message that you just gave there, that actually no one really cares about your features. yeah, of course they want some benefits, but you're right. The Andy Bounds afters, what happens after I finish? What happens after you've gone through the training? What happens after you've kitted out your accommodation with the furniture that we provide? That's really where the fun happens for the buyer, doesn't
That's
it?
exactly it, Matt. And straight away, knowing only a fraction about the business that I work in now, you've been like, okay, that's what they care about. Great. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. Whereas a lot of people maybe talk about other things before that, in advance of that, which can come down to it when you're getting into the nitty gritty and you may be up against a competitor and you're trying to differentiate yourself. But ultimately, that's what you shouldn't be focusing on. One of the big frameworks that I teach to my staff and in any consultancy stuff that I've done around sales training has been thinking about so what. So whatever statement you put forward, whatever feature, whatever benefit, whatever question you're being asked to answer, think about what does it actually mean. So like the customer should sit back and you could say, oh, we have £2 million worth of stock in our warehouse in Manchester. So what? Well, it means that we can respond quickly and have short lead times so that if you do have an immediate requirement for furniture, we're able to deliver quickly without disruption. All these things come back to a lot of basic human psychology in terms of focusing on their needs over your own. And there's been lots of people I've spoken to in the podcast, like Andy Bounds, and more recently an American guest called Ian Cognac. He was talking about moving from internal to external and making sure that you're not focusing on me, and my target and my commission and my product and my service, and instead focusing on the customer. And there's so many different ways to communicate that, but it all comes down to that one fundamental, as you were saying as well, Matt. It's all about them and understanding what role you can play for them and how you can be of service.
Yeah, I love that, Colin. And actually, that while you were talking there, my mind was just thinking also about the fact that, well, so what is perfect for the client, the prospect, or if you're a champion, so what actually is very, very relevant as well for the salesperson. Because I remember my very first sales manager, and I'm going to go right back to 1998, mate, a wonderful guy called Ray Foley. And he used to use the so what expression pretty much every single day when I would come back into the office after visiting a client or had been out on the road for a couple of days, all feeling really chipper because I'd had some great meetings. And he would always say, yeah, but so what? And I go, oh, what do you mean? He said, well, so what happens next? And it was that what happens next thing that was drilled into me from a very early age, because if I go into a room expecting that something needs to happen at the end of it, I'll make sure that I raise that subject in some way, shape or form while I'm in front of that person, so that when I go back to see my boss, Ray, and he says, so what, Matt? I say, well, I'll tell you what next. We've got a meeting in 2 weeks' time and there's a couple of actions to do as well. So it's really sound and sage advice, Colin. I love that. Listen, I want to talk about the podcast, and it staggers me to some extent when I look at where you are right now, because I think we both accept now. I want to pick your brains on this rather than me tell the listener, but it's an interesting journey when we go on a podcasting journey, isn't it? Because there are a whole bunch of variables at play. One of them is, and we'll touch on this, I'm sure, in a second, is the ability to be persistent and consistent. You are now, at time of recording this, at 236 episodes, which means that by the time this goes out, you'll have added probably another 4 or 5, because you're putting one out at least once a week, I think. Let me ask you right from the get-go, what was it that was going through your mind those years ago where you thought, right, I'm going to start a podcast?
There was a number of different factors at play, Matt, and the first of those was I had grown a social media presence on Instagram, primarily talking about how, as a sales guy traveling the UK and pursuing targets and being under pressure, I was both building and improving on my physique and pursuing my own personal development. And
yeah, can I just say at that point as well, if you haven't checked Colin out on Instagram, you need this guy's in great shape, by the way. So I can totally understand how you built a following.
Yeah, that was the initial stuff that I was doing online in terms of creating. And I'm talking early 2019. I was invited on 4 or 5 different podcasts across the first 6 months to talk about some of the habits I've got, some of the different ways I get access to different gyms, what I do for my nutrition, what I do for my hotels and my sleep quality, and different routines that I've got. And each time I was sharing that with my audience on my Instagram story or on my grid, and I was getting phenomenal feedback. But not only that, from a personal perspective, I was a massive podcast listener. I listened to sales podcasts. I listened to personal development podcasts. I listened to football podcasts. And I loved having these longer form conversations. And I didn't really love the way Instagram was going, where it at the time when I grew the most, I think I was around about 11,000 followers quite quickly. I was posting a photo, whether it was me training, whether it was me eating, whether it was me out a walk, whatever it was. I would post that photo with quite a long caption explaining a different concept that I was enjoying, and I really enjoyed the writing process. But let's hark back to the fact that I wanted to be a sports journalist when I was younger, so I do like writing. And I grew really quickly, but Instagram started optimizing more for video. It started optimizing more for like very clickbait stuff that was a little bit more surface level, and people weren't spending time reading the captions, and I was enjoying it less and less. And I thought, do you know what? This podcasting thing is a lot more my bag. I think I can contribute in this space. And I feel passionate about it. And as somebody who loves the actual platform, why don't I be a creator as well as a consumer? And fast forward to July 2019, I bought the equipment. I replaced the laptop that I had at university that used to sound like a Boeing 747 when it was charging up, because it really run its course. I bought the webcam, I bought the microphone, I downloaded the software that I thought I would need to upload, but I just never found the time to fit it in. And that's certainly something that we can talk about as the conversation goes in terms of finding the time. But it took until the lockdown of March 2020 for me to actually start recording. And it was just a case of I freed up all this time in terms of commuting, going out, doing anything really. And I can now assign towards it. And I just felt I can really contribute to this space for my own enjoyment, but also shifting from the amount of effort I was putting into my Instagram following. I can put this into a podcast, and it's actually something that's more within my wheelhouse and somewhere that I'll probably get more of a positive feedback loop both internally, but also more of a ripple effect in terms of the people listening. And that was really the initial drivers, Matt, that one, I love the platform. Two, I was getting good feedback when I was appearing as a guest. And I thought, do you know what? I think I can do something positive in this space, and let's turn my time and my attention towards it.
Amazing. And did you, when you first found your first guest, did you already have a line of other guests in the wings? Did you create a kind of a pipeline of guests to come on the podcast? Or did you just say, I'm just going to go and have a conversation with one person and see what happens next?
No, certainly not. I was somebody that knew if I was going to do it, there needed to be a longevity to it. And anyone that's listening to this that works in sales, which I suspect most of you do, you know that if your budget and your target is 100 grand, you need more opportunity in the funnel than 100 grand in order to hit that target, because nothing's going to come through 100%. Something's going to come up. So I had to make sure that there was enough in the backlog that, let's say, for example, the lockdown had ended in week 3 and everyone's lives had opened up, and it was a lot harder to get somebody on an hour Zoom call or a 2-hour Zoom call, depending on what I was doing. Then I would have fallen off and I missed my weekly uploads. You mentioned I've released 236 episodes at the time of recording. Every single Sunday since the 1st of April 2020, I've released at least one episode, quite often releasing a second episode on a Wednesday, just based on how I've got on that week or how I've got on in the weeks previous. And that for me was a contract that I signed with myself, because I recognized that my own listening habits to the different shows that I liked were based on them forming part of my routine. And knowing that on a Monday morning, I typically listen to the new Modern Wisdom episode, or on a Tuesday, I listen to the episode from the Sales Evangelist, who was like an American guy that I used to listen to back then. Yeah. And I knew that if I was to play a role in somebody's week and to be part of that, I would have to become part of their habit and part of their routine. And so I made a commitment that I needed a backlog of episodes. And I think I had about 6 recorded when I reached out to Chris Williamson, host the Modern Wisdom podcast, who at the time I thought was brilliant, but he was pretty underrated back then, whereas now he's kind of exploded.
I've got it on my list of questions, but we should go there now. How the hell did you pull that off?
I mentioned I was a long-term listener to podcasts. Chris started his show in 2018, and I found it pretty early. I'm maybe like episode 6 or 7 I started listening to it. Yeah, and I was sharing it to my Instagram story, and I would tag him. And much like myself, particularly in the early days when I maybe had fewer tags and fewer people listening and supporting, I would love to get feedback from those people that had shared it to their Instagram story and understand what they felt moved by, what they enjoyed, maybe other guests they wanted to hear from. And he was asking me those types of questions as somebody that was clearly engaged and clearly supportive. So we had quite a lot of back and forth. Now, I was very much, quote unquote, just a listener, and we just had back and forth. He didn't follow me back or love my content or anything like that. But he trusted me as somebody that was within his audience and was not just there. I wasn't there to gain anything from him. I just loved his show and was super passionate about listening to it and sharing it with my audience. Yeah. And we had a lot of back and forth. And so when it got to March 2020, I'd recorded these 6 episodes. He had shared a new course that he was launching around elective sobriety, which is something I'm a big proponent of in terms of maybe not necessarily needing to stop drinking alcohol, but not drinking alcohol for sustained periods where you draw a line and you say, oh, I'm focusing on X, Y, and Z during this time. I won't be drinking. I'll have no hangovers. I'll have no wasted money, wasted calorie, wasted time. Yeah. And Chris shared that, and he asked for my feedback. I think he must have just been like, as you would as from a sales perspective, reach out to your hot leads, because I was somebody that was a big fan of his content, and he just sent me the promo video and he said, what do you think of this? Like, I appreciate you might not want to sign up from it, but as somebody who's listened to me for many hours over the last 2 years, what do you think of how this has come across? And I sent him a voice note with some feedback about it. I actually mentioned that I had a sales background, and I thought, oh, well, why don't you mention some of the more downstream effects in terms of what people can expect if they personally do the course and stuff like that? And he really appreciated that. And then a couple of weeks later, I messaged him to say, I've got these 6 episodes recorded. I'm really, really set on launching a podcast. I would love for you to be the first guest as somebody who's really inspired me with the content they've created. And we were all locked inside. We were all in lockdown in the depths of it. And he said, yeah, absolutely. Monday night, let's do it. Let's jump on.
Fantastic.
And we did.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Because, I mean, where is he? In terms of global podcasts, he's what, top 10?
He must be. That's him being on Joe Rogan twice now, and I think genuinely maybe somewhere around 500 million people he's reached with this podcast. So like one of the genuine big impacts. And I'll tell you this, Matt, I really thought back in 2020, I thought his podcast was brilliant, like absolutely brilliant. But it was a real hidden gem back then. Not many people knew about it. If you knew, you knew, so to speak. And I think some of the, like, it's quite funny. Many people who maybe come across my show go back and listen to that first episode, and they still message me and be like, that was really good. And I was like, yeah, well, I thought I had a decent skill set back then, but I really think he did. And I thought his messaging back then is quite similar to what he has now, albeit it's just maybe a tiny bit more polished because he's done more reps, he's done more practice. And I've gone on to meet up with him a few different times at a few different shoots that we've collaborated on for a couple of different brands, which have been amazing. I saw him at his live show in, I want to say November in Manchester, and we had a quick catch up. But I never ever take that relationship for granted or try and use it for too much leverage. I'm very respectful of it, because at some point in the future, I would absolutely love to have Chris back on the show. I would love to do that one in person and maybe use it to mark like a particular milestone, maybe episode 300, maybe episode 250, who knows if that comes round. And just having that contact in the phone book, and having somebody who is a real trailblazer for UK creators, because I don't think there's really anyone else that's done it the way he's done it. And done it in such an authentic, real way versus maybe some of the other people who've tried to growth hack their way to success.
It's just a fabulous story, and everything that you spoke about there in terms of the way that you reached out to him, the way that you know, it's kind of selling, right? And I know you don't mean it, and I don't mean it like that, Colin, because it's not about selling someone like Chris. It's about effectively finding something in common, starting a conversation, and then nurturing that conversation. It's Stephen Covey's emotional bank account, isn't it? You invest, you give to people so that you're in credit, so that when there's a relevant opportunity to withdraw something, you've got some money in the bank. And I just think it's a fabulous metaphor for selling. And it's just, I'll just sort of end that Chris Williamson bit by saying it is amazing when you find that actually your podcast, the very first guest that you had on was someone the size of his show. So hats off to you, my friend. Kudos. On that subject, let's not get off there, because I mean, obviously, 236 as we speak. Different guests will appeal to different people. I'm not big into the crypto world. You've done loads with some really great guests on crypto, so I perhaps haven't leaned into those episodes as much. But some of the other guys that I really do enjoy listening to, and I look at your list, and obviously we've spoken about Andy Bounds, fabulous. Paul Mort's a great guy as well, isn't he? In terms of the men's performance development space and mental well-being. Spencer Lodge. Really enjoyed his stuff. One of the guys I really enjoy is Brad Burton. You must have had some fun with Brad.
Yeah, you're naming some really big characters there, and Brad was.
I mean, these guys are all off the charts in terms of numbers as well. So I mean, they may not be quite as large in terms of podcast numbers as Chris Williamson, but in their own right, these guys are racking up numbers of followers across their own different platforms, aren't they?
And typically there's a reason for that. That's not the case with every single person that's got a massive audience, but these guys really, they speak from the heart, they have real value to give, and that's what makes a great guest, because they can also communicate why they are in the position they're in. And quite often they have a story as well, which can be supportive of the insights they bring, because you and I both know that facts tell, stories sell, and people really buy into these guys because of the journeys they've been on and some of the frameworks or suggestions and insights that they can bring forward. And that's always been an important part of anyone that comes on my show. And yeah, Brad Burton, for example, super high energy character. Actually, quite funny. He'd listened to one of my podcasts a couple of weeks before I approached him. I think it might have been the one with Paul Mort potentially, because these guys do cross over.
They do.
So when you start to have one or two of them, they really are much more likely to come on your show because they recognize that somebody else has validated it off the back of that. Chris Williamson's a great name for that as well, in terms of social proof that your show is what you say it is. And that's been really, really valuable in terms of when I'm approaching guests. I will mention ones in the backlog that I know they're maybe acquainted with too.
Beautiful segue, by the way. And just the Brad Burton thing, fabulous. I remember going to a sales expo down in London at Docklands, probably, almost 10 years ago when I first started off in self-employment. And I walked into the Excel and the usual classic exhibition, Colin, as you know, and you'll be familiar with. And there was just this massive gaggle of people trying to get into this one area where there was a speaker, and it was him. And so when I first saw him 10 years ago, I wouldn't say he's not changed much, has he? That's the great thing about people like Brad Burton. He's completely authentic. He's slightly got a larger screen, and perhaps the show music's a little bit louder, but it's still the same Brad Burton, isn't it? Which is part of the, I guess, the
charm. That's completely correct. And do you know the funny thing about Brad? His title, the UK's #1 motivational speaker. He jokes that he basically made that up himself. There's no governing body that decides that. The whole joke is you ask him why he does that, and he said, "Go to page 26 of my book," and he opens it up, and it's literally like a one word, or like a one sentence chapter. Said, "I made it up. I decided I was," and that's the same in the sales space. Actually, do you know? Many listeners will be familiar with Benjamin Dennehy, the UK's most hated sales trainer. He became quite friendly with Brad. They're actually quite close, and he gave him the advice to basically give himself some sort of validated random title and just run with it. And most hated, a lot of people wouldn't argue with you for that, but it's so stand out that Benjamin's been able to build a really, really strong brand around it as well. And he was actually, and he says this publicly, he's been on my show, it's not been released yet, but Benjamin's very public about the fact that that's where he got it from, and that's who he was inspired by, and it's been a massive marketing tool ever since.
Folks, I want to briefly interrupt this show to share a word from our sponsor. Sales Cadence, my sales training and coaching company, provides the investment that brings this show to you, and I want to share something with you that I think you might find useful. You see, all of my clients who invest in my sales training and coaching get access to a whole variety of really helpful sales content. And one of the things that tends to get asked for more than most is how do you ask really insightful questions during discovery and qualification. You see, time spent here positively challenging and inspiring buyers tends to lead ultimately to the events that lead to a sale. And I want to share with you 75 of the right questions to ask your prospect with you. It's my gift to you for being a listener to the podcast. So look, if you'd like to receive the 75 right questions to ask, the ones that will reassure, create impact, inspire growth, avoid the things that get deals hijacked, and create seamless transition towards a close, simply connect with me on LinkedIn and then direct message me with the word RIGHT, RIGHT, and they're yours. Now back to the episode. Let's just finally end on the guest thing, because the question I'm going to ask is, how do you get guests? And I suspect there's a number of different answers depending on where someone is in their journey of podcasting. You're probably doing all the hard work in the early days, perhaps less so now. But the one that obviously is just cataclysmic is Daniel Priestly. So I know when you were over in Dubai, I think this year, you had an opportunity to interview him. Tell me how you went out and got him in a room with you, mate.
There was a few different factors at play with Daniel. Number one is the validation of the archive that I have in terms of the number of reps that I've done. I've got the whole tagline of being a top 1% global podcast, which helps in terms of ratings and downloads and viewership that he would get access to. But again, he's been on all the biggest shows. So that's not a flex in terms of, I've actually got quite a big audience to listen to.
That's table stakes, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's basically your buy-in. Like, you have to meet that entry requirement to go on or to have him on. Typically, he has done some smaller shows that have been in the archive as well, because when I was researching for him and listening to other interviews, I did see there was a few smaller shows as well, but there would have been a reason for that, I'm sure.
Are you talking to him or are you talking to his team?
This is an interesting one. So I interviewed a lady called Rebecca Hollis, who works for ScoreApp, which is one of Daniel's companies. Many people in sales will know all about ScoreApp and the potential uses it has for either stress testing a potential new business or a new product or a new service. And I saw on Daniel's social media that he was going to Dubai for a conference and a speech. And I thought, I'm there the same dates. That has got to happen. So I messaged Rebecca, who I don't speak to lots, but I'd had on the show. Everyone that I've had on the show, I would say, 99.9%, I'm still able to reach out to and have a conversation with, albeit there's varying levels of friendship and acquaintanceship or a business that are there. And I said to Rebecca, spotted that Daniel's out in Dubai the same dates as me. You know him better than anyone. What would be your advice for getting him on the show other than a cold email or a cold LinkedIn message?
That's you remembering classic Andy Bound sales training techniques. It's true though, isn't it?
You're right. There's a lot to be said for that. Now, Rebecca said he gets invited on a podcast 3 to 4 times a week on average, sometimes more than that. So he's extremely selective. And I said, completely agree. I don't want to be just one of those 3 or 4 because I'll probably get put to the bottom of the pile and he might see it after I've been in Dubai, which is no use to anyone. So initially, Rebecca gave me his PA's email address and I thought, okay, that's fine. That's his PA. That's probably better than most people who send it to, I don't know, Daniel Priestly at dentglobal.com or whatever, which will just be a humongous number of emails that come into that on a daily basis. And Rebecca and I, then she voice noted me to say, I've got an idea. Why don't you message him on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram with the title of your message, not being like podcast invite or anything like that. And I can maybe talk more about the titles that I put on my emails.
Yeah.
But put see you in Dubai, Daniel, because then straight away he's probably going to open that more quickly than anything else. So Rebecca is a saleswoman in her own right. Believe me, she knows how to sell. And that was what I started with. And then I went into my usual kind of pitch email, which is typically structured with the 3 whys. And this is giving away some of my secrets here. So why you, why me, why now?
Yep.
So why you is a compliment or exact reference to a piece of content or topic or piece of value that I've taken from that guest or something that I admire about them. Why me is my social proof and credentials. So that's what the podcast is about, where it sits in the global rankings, who I've had on previously. And why now is a call to action based on dates or venues or some sort of trigger point to make the conversation happen as well. And that's what I used to approach Daniel. But having the top of the email be see you in Dubai ? Daniel, that was on Facebook, it was on LinkedIn, it was on Instagram. And Rebecca messaged me back to say that he's texted me to say he's seen it because I mentioned her name in the message. And she was like, you just have to phone his PA tonight and make it happen. So I phoned his PA. She was absolutely lovely. Like, as you can imagine, somebody who operates at that level, she has to be super efficient. So bang, 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 we made it happen. I got 2 hours in the diary on one of the mornings that I was in Dubai. I think Daniel had flown in the day before. I'd flown in the day before. We were both a bit bleary-eyed and tired, but we got caffeinated and we had a really, really good conversation. And he was really complimentary of the general structure, but the last 15 minutes, he said that it was places that he hadn't gone on almost any other show that he'd done, because I asked him about a few different tweets and perspectives that he'd shared that were quite old. So I really did my research rather than just maybe asking about the typical business things he got asked about. We got to go quite deep on a few different areas, and he appreciated that because regardless of how quote unquote good a podcast he goes on, sometimes it can be a little bit identikit, and that's what you want to avoid, albeit there are things that he's obviously going to bring up every single time because it's part of his story, because it's part of his mindset, because it's part of his expertise. But sometimes creating a point of difference will create a lot of respect and more likelihood that he'll want to collaborate and share the posts off the back of it and get it out to his audience.
I could unpack so many outstanding sales techniques, and again, I don't want to use the word technique because it sounds very hard and abrasive, but mate, you're a born salesman, because that is exactly, if there was ever advice on how you go and target a prospect and then engage with them and go through a persistent way of ultimately nurturing that opportunity, I guess you just described it there. So just genius. And
My sales background, Matt, is a huge reason why the show is where it is. It's why I've got on guests that I've not had on, that other people of my size at the time wouldn't have been able to get, because I was able to position it in the right way. And you mentioned, like, obviously there's outreach like that. I look for referrals all the time for guests, in terms of if such and such knows somebody else, can you ask them? In our circles, you'll know Mr. Chris Reeve, absolute gentleman. I think he probably introduced you and I, to be honest, back in the day.
Yeah, he did.
So again, I asked Chris for a referral. Through Chris, I've spoken to Simon Thomas, who is, many will know as the ex-Blue Peter, Sky Sports presenter, and somebody with an incredible story and incredible mindset. So there's countless examples of somebody else who had a good experience on my show, introducing me to somebody else who would want to have a similar experience, whether that's somebody that's of a bigger profile, or whether that's just somebody that I know will respond better to that referral than they will to maybe a cold email. And don't get me wrong, I'm never shy of a cold email, but if you can get a referral, that's always a good way into cover both bases. There's a lot of value to give from that. And I'm in a network probably with 4 or 5 other hosts that have shows of roughly a similar size and pretty similar demographic, albeit slightly different approaches to the different topics that we cover with the same guest roughly. But I've shared guests many, many times with other hosts. I really come from a place of abundance in that perspective, because these things do come back around. And there's enough podcasting hours, listening in people's time and diary for a host in my space to have somebody on that I've already had on as well. And there's no need to kind of hold on too tightly to them, albeit if somebody was just ask and never gave, then you wouldn't continue that. But I've got probably 3 or 4 other guys that we really have passed around some fantastic guests to each other. You mentioned the concept of like having like emotional credit in the bank. One of the guests that I got introduced to was Dr. Meg J. She's one of the most viewed ever TEDx speakers, and she's got a number of excellent books. She's got a new one coming out this year that I'll hopefully interview her for as well. She's got a concept called identity capital, and it's very similar to what you were talking about. If you gain these experiences, you gain these that kind of principle of reciprocity with different friends and groups, you can cash in on that at different times. But if you're always trying to cash in, then you're going to end up bankrupt. And I really, really buy into that approach, and it's something that I've stood by for a long, long time now.
On the Daniel Priestley thing, where at the end of the episode, he commented on, the way that you ask questions, and some of the questions that you asked him obviously quite unique, given the fact that you're absolutely right. There is a tendency, certainly with some of the really big names, to hear the same message pretty much on most episodes. Daniel's brilliant. But what I'm really curious to know is, at the end of that conversation where you kind of almost brought this kind of emotional construct together, because he did comment and compliment you on your interview style. Did you watch the one recently with James Sinclair and Daniel?
I've not watched it yet. I've only recently discovered James Sinclair. I think he'd be a great guest on my show, and I think he's doing really, really well. But I've not watched it. I've seen the clips from it because they've been collaborating on the reels on Instagram.
So Colin, that's 2 hours and 45 minutes. Just exceptional business conversation, because it wasn't. It was like a fireside chat. At some points, Daniel was quite rattled in a positive way, because James was asking him questions that probably he wasn't used to being asked before. And so therefore he's having to dig deep into his own personal value set to come up with the right answer, not one that he knew off the top of his head because he's always asked it. It's a fascinating
That's great.
listen.
And I think somebody like James, who, albeit I've only just come across, he's an experienced interviewer and an experienced businessman. He's earned his stripes to do that. I would say, without being arrogant or big-headed, but being self-assured, I feel that I can ask different questions now, and I can push back sometimes if there's an area of disagreement between the guest and myself that I couldn't do in the early days. But that comes with practice. In the same way, in a sales meeting, you come with a little bit more abundance when you've got a track record of closing deals of a similar size or working with similar customers. You're able to be slightly less subservient and much more able to have a conversation on a level footing. And I think that's very, very important in sales, but it's also very important in the podcasting space. Like, I definitely look up to Daniel Priestley, but if there was an area that we went that I thought I could add a different perspective and a different take, I would have willingly done so. And I think that also provides a lot of value to the listener as well, because some of the podcasts I listen to where it's a little bit like too much nod, agree, especially if the host doesn't actually think that way, or they do an episode where it contrasts with that in the future. That's one of my pet peeves.
And I love what you just said there, Colin, as well, which is when you become more comfortable in your own skin, you can ask those challenging questions and you can positively push back, because let's be honest about it, everybody's got their own opinion, and maybe their opinion is slightly different to yours. Doesn't mean to say you're right or wrong, but that's what makes for a really great episode. Would you agree?
Yeah, agree so strongly. And I think there's an element of having a structure to a conversation and an element of having a structure to a sales meeting. But if you don't listen, you might miss the gold. You might miss the opportunity to ask the follow-up question, which unlocks everything that you really need to hear, whether that's in a podcast or whether that's from a potential customer that's going to tell you exactly how to really win their business that they wouldn't tell you if you don't ask that question.
Yeah.
And the number of times I've had a guest on where, because I've sat and listened and they've said something I didn't expect, and I'll be like, oh, what do you mean by that? And that's when you really get a 15-minute back and forth off the back of that one little prompt, just because you really did listen and you just probed that little bit harder. Whereas, as you say, in the early days, it's inevitable that you are a little bit more worried about moving on to the next question because you know that's something that you want to cover and you think the audience will want to hear as well. But guess what? The audience will probably want to hear a free-flowing conversation on some of the points that you're doing too. While, of course, from a listening perspective, you can't linger too long on the one point and do it to death. Yeah. You have to have the professionalism to say, one of the things I really want to cover with you today, Colin, is podcasting. In the same way when we were covering sales earlier and we knew we were going to move on from that, that's absolutely fine. But we've maybe talked about things within the sales perspective that we're never going to be scripted, so to speak. And I think that's so important to have that nice balance between the two.
Colin, this might be a weird question. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're interviewing a guest and for some reason you just believe this is never going to work for your audience, and so you're either going to let them down gently and say that you're not going to publish it, or what? Have you ever been in that situation at all?
That's a great question, and it is a real risk that you have a conversation that doesn't serve your audience whatsoever as well. The number of reps that I've done means that yes, there have been conversations that I've had that haven't gone out. A couple of times it has been based on the audio quality or the video quality or the connection quality. And once or twice it has been because I didn't feel the guest put themselves forward in the best possible light. A couple of occasions that has led to us actually re-recording.
Okay.
Once in particular on the guest request, actually. They said they felt they had a real off day and they maybe didn't come across in the way that they wanted to. And I said I was more than happy to re-record on that basis. A couple of times I've emailed to say, just based on how the conversation went, I'm not sure that we covered the areas that are the most relevant to the demographic of my audience. Really sorry to have wasted an hour of your diary and your precious time. If you would like to re-record and cover areas more in line with X, Y, and Z, then I'm more than happy to. But if not, no hard feelings, hopefully. And most people have taken that the right way, because it's not a game changer. Like, I'm going to release it to many thousand people, but it also, if you get released to that number of people and you maybe didn't come across in a great way, you're not going to get the benefits of the audience maybe connecting with you on LinkedIn or following you on Instagram or sending you a message to say how much they enjoyed it or what they want to ask around. So I think people typically understand that, and I think leading with honesty in that case, and of course offering some sort of olive branch, whether that's a re-recording or not, would be the best path forward for me typically.
Yeah, that's fair. And so now that you've got such an established podcast in the marketplace, I'm guessing you're probably getting a fair amount of inbound requests from people who want to be guests. You know, I get a few, you'll get quite a few. How do you disqualify or qualify to get the right guest for your show? Because I'll guess some won't fit as best as some do.
I was talking to a friend about this the other day because I received a message for an inbound request that was just not sent in the right way whatsoever. And I actually took a screenshot of it and sent it to my friend. It obviously stayed confidential in terms of who sent the message, but it just wasn't the right approach at all. It was very much a, hi mate, big fan of what you're doing with the podcast. Would love to come on and talk about insert business name and how it's grown over the last 2 years. Not really the value that we're looking for in terms of for the audience, for myself and for them. It needs to be a win-win situation.
Yeah.
In the early days of the podcast, because it wasn't established that strongly, yes, I started off with Chris Williamson, but there was lots of room for people to come on to add to the number of episodes. I got a lot more inbound inquiry, and then in the middle period where you're basically doing a lot of graft and you're growing, and sometimes you're growing some weeks and other weeks you're not growing at all, and there's long periods of stagnation and plateauing. there wasn't that many inbounds actually, because I wasn't really being like blasted out to the world, and people weren't maybe coming across it as often as they are now.
Yeah.
And then in the last kind of 5-6 months in particular, that December period where I went to Dubai, had Daniel Priestley, Adam Power, Marcus Hustle, some really like prominent business figures, and the show grew probably about 20-25%. I got a huge barrage of inbound inquiry. Some of it done really well, and those guests have actually gone on to be on the show. Some of it done very poorly, and those guests have not appeared in the show. What I'm looking for is, one, what topics or areas of expertise do they have that relate to my audience, which typically are focused on self-development in the 3Bs, which is brain, body, business. Don't get me wrong, there's lots of others that go within that, whether like in business you can go wider and you go financial, and that might be investing, it might be trading, it could be whatever area when it comes to a financial perspective. And if somebody contributes or creates content in that area, and they don't need to be a subject matter expert, but they need to have some sort of level of advice or insights or story in that area, then they might be a good fit. The layer down from that will be their ability to communicate that, whether that's they maybe send me links to previous podcast episodes they've been on where I can hear them communicate, hear how they converse. Number 3, like, and this is absolutely not the most important one, but some sort of track record of building an audience in that space where people actually listen to them talk about it. Because the guy that's got 100 people following him on Instagram and he's posted 8,000 times, he's probably not hitting the mark, and there's something he's saying that's not quite right, whether that's quality or whether that's actually the information itself. And that is important, but it's not the be all and the end all. I've had people on the podcast who have really almost no audience whatsoever, but I know their story and I've heard them speak about it, whether that's been on video, whether that's been in person. And I've been like, okay, we could have a fantastic conversation, because the ability to converse is vital. You could have somebody with a huge TikTok that has never been able to hold down an hour-long conversation, and they just would not be a good guest whatsoever. You could have somebody, and I mentioned this before we hit record, Matt, they might write these amazing LinkedIn posts and give a lot of value on there, but they maybe can't verbalize it, or they don't really like to have conversations. They get a bit nervous or they get a bit uncomfortable, and they're not going to be good in an hour-long conversation. Those are big factors that I consider when it comes to an inbound inquiry, and that actually matters for outbound as well, because I find a lot of my guests on social media, authors or blog writers or people that are basically creating and sharing themselves out there, they're much easier to find and decide whether they're going to be a good fit.
That's such great advice. And what I like about that, Colin, is we're now just sort of turning the tables on any would-be guests by almost giving them a word of warning. Because you know and I know that when we hit record and we start the mics, yes, we're recording it, and of course there can be some editing, but less and less so these days. I believe, you know, there's definitely a propensity to have a very raw conversation rather than something that's heavily edited.
That's my preference, massively so.
Yeah, me too, and I'm certainly a big fan of that, and I feel that the audience wants, they're kind of given up on the polished stuff these days. They just want if the content works, you can be anywhere. It can sound, in some cases, it can sound not particularly great in terms of the sound quality, but the content is the most important, and that's why I think it's potentially a bit of a word of warning to anyone who's thinking about being a guest on someone's podcast. When they hit record, that's you, right? That is you right there for 60 minutes, not just for 60 minutes, for the rest of time. Because it's going to sit there for the rest of the time, and you're effectively putting yourself in the lion's mouth, aren't you?
Yeah, it's evergreen content, and that's the mad part of some of the guests that came on my show. So I think we were episode 33 or something like that, Matt. I used to know all the episodes off by heart until we got to about 100. I used to know, I'd be like, Matt Sykes, episode 33, or Andrew Craig, episode 42, or whoever it was, and that there's now too many of them for me to remember them all by number. But when the podcast gets discovered and it has that bump of 20-25%, the archive gets a lot of plays as well. And that's a great thing for guests that came on in the early days. But it's also a scary thing, as you say, because if you maybe went on a show and you didn't communicate the bit as best as you could, or you weren't quite sure how you came across, you maybe said something that you really, really regret and you maybe don't stand by anymore, then that's out there forever. It's kind of that evergreen content. And that's obviously a concern. So just making sure that as a guest, you're turning up and you're feeling well prepared, you're feeling confident, and it's the host's job to make sure that you feel that way to some extent, but also your own to prepare and think about what might be the most important stuff to impart upon that audience or get across.
So I want to touch on you've monetized the podcast in a couple of different directions. Just walk me through, because I guess most podcasters at some point feel that they need to or would like to, and there's no either way works, that they want to try and find some way of getting some kind of financial validation from the podcast. You go down the sponsor route. Is that right?
That's correct. A portion of my episodes will have a sponsorship on it, primarily driven to cover the costs which I have incurred for growing. Those costs primarily come from a guy that does my video editing for clips on social media. So the shorts that I put on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and LinkedIn, of course. That is paid for primarily by the sponsors. It pays for the studio time, whether that's the studio here in Glasgow or when I go to Dubai or London or Manchester and I've recorded there. There is a reasonable premium to recording in high quality there, and they have been very important for guests that are based in that region or based in that city to have those conversations. Because while you and I are having a fantastic conversation just now, and I've never ever restricted myself to just interviewing people in my locality or where I am physically, that's been very important as well for the audience's growth and the value and the consistency of upload that I've had. I do know that for particular guests, having them in person does make a difference to how that episode performs.
Exactly.
So that's been important. So the costs have mainly come from that. I've got a guy that does the thumbnails for YouTube, because I really started to take YouTube seriously probably about 6-7 months ago and start to really improve the quality of what was going on there. That incurs some costs. And then largely the sponsorship costs are used to invest back in that. From a sales career perspective, I have had a very, very good 2.5 years since I moved industry and have massively scaled my income based on applying my skill set in an arena that has rewarded me more so than the insurance sector. And I've reinvested some of that capital back into the podcast. The podcast washes its face, absolutely, but I've never looked at it as the singular fiscal vehicle for success for me at this moment in time, because I'm extremely patient about what that might look like and what that means. So that's been important from that perspective. But yes, sponsorship with brands that align with who my audience are and the demographic they're from, which is primarily people that are interested in improving their brain, improving their body, improving their business, improving their career, and improving their lifestyle. So brands that I've worked with will be like supplement brands, meal prep brands, coaching brands, clothing brands to some extent as well. And I've been very, very hyper selective of that, because you could partner with yet another, I don't know, VPN service or something like that, which albeit might work for a small portion of my audience. I'm much more likely to have a broader appeal brand or service or product that would go on there and make sure that the discount is of significant value, that they couldn't get that discount unless they're listening to CamBro Conversations.
Yeah, if I just use my own example, to get an episode out, you probably end up spending between £150 and £200 if you're outsourcing that editing. So it's not it's a reasonable investment, especially if at your level where you're banging them out once a week. That's a fair amount of dough, and so absolutely monetize where you can, and certainly if you can, like you do, then why not help people out by aligning what you feel and value most in your life in terms of fitness and business and mindset. Try and find people that work in that environment for the obvious reason, because that's obviously
there's got to be that overlap, Matt, because otherwise it won't work for the brand either.
Yeah, you've got to have used it, got benefit from it, and be willing to stand on the soapbox and tell the world about it. That's the best fit, really, isn't it?
Agreed.
And so then the other thing, which I think is just brilliant and really, really to some extent obvious, but I'm going to say smart, is you've taken all of your knowledge and experience of this journey that you've been on, and 230 odd episodes, and you've packaged it up and turned it into an online course. What was going through your mind when you decided to do that?
I was being asked more and more and more in the DMs about how to start a podcast. And hi mate, could I pick your brains for 30 minutes? Could we grab a coffee? Can I buy you lunch? And I did a couple of those, and the show's never launched. And I thought, okay, that's a problem. One, in terms of the time that I invested in that person, and two, in terms of maybe how much support they actually needed to make this a success.
You need to go back to that Benjamin Dennehy episode. I'm pretty sure he'll talk about free advice.
Yes, exactly. People don't value it. He encourages staff in companies to pay towards the training that the company's putting on for them, which I think is a very clever psychological thing for people to understand.
Yeah.
So you're completely correct. The next stage was I would jump on a StreamYard or a Zoom call with somebody for a set fee. I think I was charging about 100, 140 quid for an hour with me to go through. I recorded the call on video and audio, and they'd be sent that afterwards. And I would cover the main tenets and the processes that they would go through in order to have a successful podcast. And I think of the maybe 10 or 12 people that were approaching me, I think maybe 8 or 9 of them took that call up for 100 however many quid it was. And I was like, okay, well, that's obviously valuable, but it's swapping my hour for time. And I'm stretched with my day job, I'm stretched with recording the podcast, and I'm stretched with living a fully active social life and training as well. So I was like, right, I should take some of the lessons that are regularly cropping up with the podcast consultancy calls and turn that into a podcast masterclass. I have many guests that have created really, really good quality online courses. And I've also seen online some terrible quality online courses that nobody has ever got value from. So I decided to go at the really high end, and I hired a videographer. We hired out a space for 2 days. And I had a Google Drive document, Matt, that was 24,000 words.
Wow. There's your book, Cole.
Yeah, exactly. And I used that as the scripting for the different modules. And there's like 9 different modules, and within that 54 different video lessons, all filmed in high quality and hosted on a platform called Thinkific. And it was what came to me quite easily and obviously, but in the same way we're talking today about the 3 whys and how I approach guests and stuff like that, that's not immediately obvious to people that maybe don't have a sales background like you and I do, in terms of how to maybe get people on your show.
Yeah.
And the majority of people launching podcasts are not salespeople. So there was a lot of sales lessons in there, and there was a lot of communications lessons in there beyond the nuts and the bolts of software and equipment and different editing tools that you can use, which of course I included in the earlier modules. It was really the hosting, the guest management, and the questioning and the research skills that I went deep on. And I think that's where the course kind of pays for itself in that regard.
100%. And just on that point about different skills, did you do your own marketing page? Because that website, I was on there yesterday doing my due diligence, and that's a really, really well written sales page. Did you put that together yourself?
Yes, I have been lucky to work with an excellent copywriter called Chris Burns, the Savage Scholar. He's been on my show on a couple of or maybe more than a couple, probably 5 or 6 roundtables. That he's a semi-regular guest every kind of 20, 30 episodes.
Yeah.
And Chris gave me some coaching about 2 years back, and he works with a lot of people to, obviously he could work with them as their copywriter, but he also coaches them to be able to do some of their own stuff. So I learned a lot of that from him, and I used that within my email list that I built out over the last few years as well. And then just turned my hand to using it for the sales page for the course as well, and kind of take people through the journey on that as well. Equally, there's always inspiration to take. So while I couldn't find many courses that delivered a podcast masterclass like mine, I could find lots of other people that had written sales pages for I don't know, an investing course, a mindset course, a fitness course. And I was like, okay, these are the kind of this is the general structure, and this is some of the things they bring up. And then of course apply things like the sales skills that we've talked about in terms of benefits over features, afters, and add that together to really build a compelling page when somebody lands on considering investing in themselves to start, scale, and sustain a podcast.
I'm going to put that in the show notes. So what's the title that people just need to look out for when they go to the show notes?
Yeah, it's mypodcastmasterclass.thinkific.com.
Brilliant. And I would, even if you're not interested in starting a podcast, I would go and look at that link, because you, as Colin has just said there, you will learn quite a lot in terms of the style and the steps and the narrative that you really want to take somebody on who's interested in potentially buying what you sell, because it takes you on a journey which ultimately builds that know, like, and trust thing. It does that risk reversal thing as well. And I think you can learn a lot just from reading the copy. So, and is it going well, Colin?
Yeah, it has. 3 of the early students have all launched their podcasts, and they are over 10 episodes already, which is so exciting, because there's
you must be like a proud parent.
Oh, honestly, one of them just one of them just interviewed Tej Talks, who's a big guy in the property space in the Midlands.
Right.
And he has a huge audience. I think he maybe has 60, 70,000 on Instagram, and he has a big podcast himself. And one of them just interviewed him and had their first episode that broke through 1,000 downloads. And I'm like, brilliant. This is so good. And they were telling, like, now don't get me wrong, because it's a course, they don't have immediate access to me. But if somebody wants to tell me about that, obviously I'm going to read that message and speak to them about that, and kind of live that hype with them, because I know that feeling. It feels amazing. So it's been great to see those early students take action and grow forward. There's a few other guys that have maybe launched their first couple episodes and are just working their way through it. And then there's plenty more students that are still going through the actual course itself. I think I said on the episode with Daniel Priestly, I created a wait list for it, and I think we had something like 80 names on the list, and on the first day about 12% of that signed up. So like, I think there was like 11 sign-ups on the first day based on that, and he said that was about right based on the appetite that I built from it. But then now that there's people that have gone through the course and have given me testimonials and are sharing their show, and it's actually like a really well produced and quality show, and they've been able to consistently do it, that's led to a lot more students being like, oh, okay, this could work for me, because it's really helpful to picture what life would look like in their shoes, because they've done the same thing. It's the whole afters concept again.
Do you just sell it through your own website, or do you also put it on things like Udemy?
So Udemy, I'm on an equivalent called Thinkific.
Yeah.
And it is the hosting platform.
Yeah.
It allows you to upload really high quality video. It allows you to link it with Stripe. It allows you to communicate with the students or for them to send questions as well. And it helped me produce that sales page. It gave me the different building blocks to build the sales page, albeit all the copy I had to write and all the different documents I had to upload as well, or the screenshots of the videos that I put into that sales page, which we're really talking about how good it was. But it was a good template for me to use, and I was able to build it out from there. So I use Thinkific. I think if I had my time again, I would use Thinkific, but I know that for more community-based programs, if I was to do something that was a bit more interactive with just me, I would maybe use School, which is Sam Ovens' platform, recently invested into by Alex Hormozy, which has got a lot of people interested.
There's a name from the past, Sam Ovens. I remember checking him out 10 years ago. And then
he's a proper OG of online education, and has built a really, really good platform. I've got a couple of friends that run courses on School, which is spelled SKOOL, and it's been really, really good for their platform and for their audience.
So 9 modules and a boatload of video content. I would heavily encourage anybody who's listen. If you are interested in starting your own podcast, go and check that out. But you've only listened to Colin for the last just over an hour, and you can tell effectively one of the questions I'm about to ask, which is what motivates you to keep going, Colin. But it's a kind of an obvious question, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an obvious question in that I very much know what my values are in terms of I like to create content. I like to have interesting conversations. I like to explore my curiosities. I like to exercise my skill set and see progress in that regard, whether that is in the download numbers or whether that's in the actual number of messages that people send you after the podcast, or even out the blue. Sometimes you'll be like, hi mate, just discovered your podcast, listen to episode with Andrew Craig, episode 42, and I've just started investing for the first time, and I've got an emergency fund built, and I'm like, wow, that is amazing. That episode is 3 years old and you're taking value from it. That keeps you going. And I'm also somebody that's very routine and habit based, and I would feel like I hadn't brushed my teeth if I didn't record at least one podcast a week, genuinely.
Oh mate, you're addicted.
Yeah, exactly that. And for me, it's going a walk in the morning. It's listening to great podcasts. It's researching for an upcoming guest. It's approaching new ones and getting that buzz when you book them in, and just chasing that the whole time. Like, one of the most biggest buzz I had recently was booking Rory Sutherland, who many people will know as the head of marketing at Ogilvy, and somebody who's been prolific in the podcast space for 4 or 5 years now. The buzz from that was amazing. Like, think about, as a sales guy, like getting that prospect that you've been chasing for weeks and weeks and weeks to take that meeting with you. That was exactly how that felt. And there's a lot to be said for those kind of continual little bumps of dopamine from the efforts that you're putting in being rewarded.
Love it. I think you've answered one of my final questions, which is how do you carve out the time? But it sounds like because it is a fundamental part of your life now, you just make time, right?
I do a lot of bundling. So that's a time management concept made popular by a lady called Cassie Holmes, who I've had on the podcast. She wrote a book called The Happier Hour.
Okay.
And bundling is something that many of us do, but we don't do it consciously. I do it extremely consciously now. So if I am drying the dishes or washing the dishes or putting away laundry or making my bed or whatever else I'm doing, or going a walk or training or driving, I am consuming great content, and I am bundling up that in terms of I'm doing my research for upcoming guests, or I'm considering guests that I want to have on, or I'm just leveling up as well. When I'm doing my admin and uploading to the CRM in my work, guess what? I'm probably listening to a podcast. When I'm training in the gym in between sets, I might write some notes down about who I want to approach, or I might send out some Instagram DMs or some emails that I can type on my phone, or I can copy and paste and amend the template to make it bespoke to that person. So I'm always using the time that's available to me. And a lot of what I'm doing, it feels like work to some people, but it doesn't always feel like work to me. A phrase that I use quite a lot on the podcast is the tools will be heavy, but they'll feel light in your hands. And that is really the case with me, where I've found an area of passion. And that's, interestingly enough, still the case. What's one of the big reasons that I still work in the sales world as a full-time career. I love closing business. I love it, Matt. Like, before we jumped in this call, I've got a big contract that's very, very close, and I can feel the sensation of all the work coming like to fruition just now. And I'm just enjoying that process of taking somebody from having never heard of my company, never used us before, to sending us the PO for a significant sum of money and signing up to the works that we're going to do for them in the summer. And that feels great. And I think when you find those different areas in your life, lean into them and just work hard in those areas.
Mate, I say it constantly to the people I work with, and those that are prepared to listen to me bore them to death, that outside of professional sport and maybe midwives, I don't think there's another career out there where the highs are so high and the lows are so low as they are in the sales industry. And if you've got the ability to get into that industry and you get the bug like you've got, Colin, like I've got, it is just a fantastic place to be for what you just said there. When you're on the edge of a really big deal and it's about to close, it's some of the most exciting times you'll ever find in your life, I think, anyway.
Yeah, and you've got to lean into it and really enjoy it as well. And anything that you learn from sales can be applied across the board. As I said, I wouldn't be in the position I am with the podcast if I hadn't built the sales skill set that I've got. And I really, really believe that.
So that sort of really nicely segues into my penultimate question, which is, what impact has the podcast had on you, Colin, as a person? And probably extend that on not just as a person, but also your career and maybe where your plans are for the future.
As a person, I have continued to become more curious and open-minded to different perspectives, which has been fantastic. I have also been able to communicate better. I thought I was pretty good at communicating before I started, but having 230 odd conversations is a very, very helpful way of refining how you speak and articulate yourself, and how you think and how you listen as well, which is a huge thing that I've applied from a career perspective as well. I really, really listen to my customer base. I repeat words back to them that they used with me, phrases that they care about. I really understand them, and I give them space to explain their ideas, or I'm willing to ask a question from a place of abundance about what they really mean by that, and not be scared to ask that question. Because as a salesperson, I think it's very important that you don't grovel and don't end up in a position where you are too subservient, because people can feel neediness. I talk sometimes about commission breath, and that is a very, very off-putting thing. I think anyone that's been in a car showroom and had a negative experience will have felt that neediness from the salesperson. That's not to shit all over people who sell cars for a living, but typically the standard in that industry is somebody who can be a little bit intense or pushy, and that's not a great feeling to have. So I really, really try and come from a place of abundance and build that relationship as a trusted advisor who, I want to work with you, but it needs to be right for both of us. And that's been huge too. And I guess in terms of like how it's impacted future plans, the podcast has opened up so many networking, business and personal development opportunities that I've grown massively. I've been able to monetize things, as you said. I've done some really cool business things and consultancy things off the back of having the podcast as well in the sales world, which was never ever the plan whatsoever. But having built my personal brand in the podcast space, I have delivered training to companies and individuals that I never thought would be possible, that I'd never built out or planned for. And that's been really, really cool as well. And it opens up the possibilities of one day working for myself, or increasing the amount that I work for myself as well. And that's all coming from a place of choice, which is fantastic. But at this moment in time, I continue to really enjoy the journey that I'm on in my sales career, and know that I've still got the bandwidth to grow the podcast more while still working and being part of a division that when I came in, was doing £1.2 million in sales, and this year it'll do about 3.8 while improving the margin. And that feels great too. And I think that's an important thing for me to stress. I don't think everyone should be an entrepreneur or a business owner or do their own thing in all cases, in all regards. Like, I've found real fulfillment from my career, and of course I've turned to the podcast to keep me activated and stimulated, but I really am finding that within my career too. And I would encourage people that are all in on their day job to really push hard in that space and find what they want in there too.
That's so I think what I heard there is there's a tangible link, as far as you're concerned, between the skills that you've learned over 236 episodes and your ability to earn income.
Absolutely, undoubtedly. It's made me a better salesperson, but also my sales ability has made me a better podcaster. They really are like, there's almost an alchemy there.
Genius. Colin, I've absolutely loved this conversation. Obviously, I have a real passion for podcasting. I've learned a lot in this conversation. I'm inspired to do even more. So thank you very much indeed for that. Where can I send folks to find you? Because we haven't even mentioned the name of the podcast. Here's your chance, mate. Just tell everybody where they can find you first, would you?
Yeah, wherever you're listening to this, you can find CamBro Conversations, most typically Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Colin T. Campbell, or if you are on Instagram, I am call.cambro, and I would absolutely love to hear from you. I reply to every single DM that I get as much as humanly possible, and if you have to wait a few days for a reply, I promise I'll get round to it. Last question, really, and
I think I'd just like you to, if you can, just to try and give some advice to somebody who's listened to this and thought, you know what, I haven't got one, but I do fit that dynamic where, you know, I would like to start a podcast. What one piece of advice would you give to someone who's thinking about starting their podcast?
I think have your why really clear, because when you have your why, you can bear any how. Because there'll be weeks where you are stressed, something happens in the family or in the workplace that stretches you, and you will have to do a little bit of work. You'll have to push forward and make the episode happen or the upload happen, despite not the ideal circumstances. So be really clear on that, and don't just do it for, I think I'm going to grow this massive podcast and be the next Chris Williamson or Joe Rogan or whoever. Really focus on what matters to you about it, and that will enable you to put in place the systems and the processes to turn up when it really, really matters, and to keep going and to keep showing up and to keep enjoying the process as well, and do it for the right reasons.
Wonderful. Colin Campbell, thank you very much indeed for joining me on the Sales Cadence podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I knew we could have a long conversation. I'm sure we could go even further. So I'm sure we'll get a chance to chat again in the future too.
I would love to do that. Cheers, Colin. Inspirational stuff, I'm sure you'll agree. Colin deserves all of the success that he's creating for himself, and clearly there's so much more heading in his direction, I've no doubt about that. As a wise man once told me, don't be surprised by the results that you get from the work that you do. And if there was ever an example of hard work, dedication to your craft, and consistency, well, Colin is that shining example. Listen, thanks so much, folks, for listening and being a part of the Sales Cadence podcast community. If you found this episode helpful, useful, even inspiring like I did, then all I would ask for you is to share it with a friend so that they can take something from it too. And listen, if you haven't got any friends, no problem. A like or a review is just as good. Until next time then, just like Colin and myself, everybody's in sales, we're all selling something. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Sales Cadence podcast.